Star Wars card games goes almost as far back as the movies itself, which launched in the summer of 1977 and promptly became one of the most popular franchises of all time. The creator of Star Wars, George Lucas, who also wrote and directed the first film, was able to secure himself an incredible deal in ensuring that he retained the licensing rights to merchandises and set about getting Star Wars branding on just about any product you can think of. Most notably in the form of Star Wars toys and games. And it's Star Wars itself that created this template which we see all the time to this day. Kenner, who held the toy license for Star Wars, released 2 Star Wars board games in 1977. Both the Escape from Death Star and Destroyed Death Star game were visually interesting, nicely packaged titles. Of course, many more board games and card games followed over the years, even when it seemed between the end of the original trilogy with 1983's Return of the Jedi and the first prequel in 1999 that there would be no more Star Wars movies. In fact, slap bang in the middle of this period were the first signs that Star Wars could find a natural home on the tabletop. West End Games produced not only the phenomenal and hugely important Star Wars the role-playing game, which actually ended up being the basis for a huge amount of Star Wars lore, giving names and history to swathes of alien races only briefly seen on screen, but also a selection of superb hex-based games that were much more modern and satisfying for older players. Card-driven asymmetrical title Assault on Hoth, solitaire title Battle of Andor, which used the same cards and combat system as the Hoth game, and the stunning, deeply detailed and strategic starship combat simulation title Star Warriors are all examples of how seriously Star Wars was being treated by West End Games during the late 80s. It would take until about the early 90s until Star Wars really got a good grasp on the card game format. When MTG launched in 1993, its success as the world's first collectible card game, or CCG, practically saw the creation of an entirely new industry forming in its wake. Gaming companies were eager to get their slice of the seemingly unstoppable growth that Wizards of the Coast was seeing. As such, countless collectible card games came and went in the mid to late 90s, many of which lured players in with their licenses. Decipher launched the Star Wars customizable card game in 1995, following the success of their well-received Star Trek card game. It was almost a no-brainer for them to tackle this. The Star Wars customizable card game featured photos of characters and movie scenes on its cards, with quite large blocks of text and different elements and symbols across the card front. The style wasn't too dissimilar overall to that found in Decipher's earlier release, the Star Trek card game, though of course each game featured iconography and overall aesthetics to match the franchise it represented. This was very common for licensed games of that era, rather than commissioning new art or repurposing images such as comic book illustrations, movie stills, and publicity shots that would feature on the cards instead. Interestingly, cards had different backs depending on whether they were light side or dark side cards. Furthermore, there was a requirement that a game must consist of one player using a light side deck against another opponent using the dark side deck. The main resource of the game, much like mana in Magic the Gathering or ink in the new Disney Lorcana as 2 examples, is appropriately Force. The Star Wars CCG was pretty long-lasting, with numerous expansions releasing between 1995 and 2001. Incredibly, despite Decipher losing the Star Wars license in 2001 to Wizards of the Coast, the Star Wars CCG is still alive today. That's thanks to the CEO of publisher Decipher, Warren Holland, who made a pretty much unprecedented move in 2002, announcing that a players committee would continue to organize tournaments and keep the game going, despite the lack of a license or official publisher support. These tournaments have been held without fail every year since 1996. In fact, the number of Round 1 participants in 2023 was higher than any year in which the game was at its commercial official peak. Prior to losing the Star Wars license altogether, Decipher also released a second CCG aimed at younger or beginner card game players based on Star Wars Episode 1: The Phantom Menace. In 1999, the same year the prequel arrived in cinemas, Young Jedi was a massively simplified game and was consequently very easy to learn and play. Even deck building was incredibly straightforward and accessible. Despite this, older Star Wars fans, particularly those who'd grown used of the deeply strategic, albeit complex Star Wars customizable card game, were turned off by its lack of depth. Somewhat surprisingly, Decipher even launched a third Star Wars game just prior to losing the license. The Jedi Knights trading card game was released in 2001 and lasted just 8 months. It does feel as if Jedi Knights was perhaps rushed in order for Decipher to squeeze the last dollars of value from their Star Wars license, though we can't be sure whether or not they knew the writing was on the wall when this game was in production. And despite a few innovations such as the card game imagery and gimmicky stereoscopic 3D art on a number of cards, it certainly feels that it was a last gasp for the once mighty custodians of the Force at Decipher. So what happened next when it came to Star Wars card games? Well, as mentioned, Wizards of the Coast picked up the license in 2001. They went on to produce their own take on the franchise with the Star Wars trading card game releasing in 2002. Designed by none other than Magic the Gathering creator Richard Garfield, the Star Wars trading card game shared the same approach as its predecessors to light side and dark side cards, as well as a reliance on photo imagery, but took an entirely different approach in just about all other areas. In Star Wars TCG, players choose a side and then battle over 3 areas on the game's playmat: space, ground, and character. This neatly presented the feel of a struggle on 3 fronts, not unlike those found in the climax of movies Return of the Jedi and The Phantom Menace at the time of its publication. The object of the game was to control 2 out of 3 areas to secure victory. In summary, you win the game by having at least 1 card in 2 of the 3 areas at the end of a round, as long as your opponent has no other cards in the same area as you. It was always going to be tough to follow such a long-running and beloved game, but the Star Wars trading card game managed to release at least 10 booster sets, covering both the prequel and the original trilogies. Overall, the Star Wars TCG was a much more accessible game than the Star Wars customizable card game, but its simplicity perhaps worked against it in this long run. During this period, Wizards of the Coast also used their Star Wars license to produce tabletop RPGs and miniatures alongside the trading card game. WizKids released the Star Wars Pocket Model TCG in 2007. I remember these vividly because it was just a whole new way of playing with trading cards, because you basically had to build them. WizKids used the same innovative format they pioneered in their Pirates of the Spanish Main constructible strategy game. In the Star Wars Pocket Model TCG, players would buy starter and booster packs that contained plastic cards, each of which allowed you to press out its pieces and build them into vehicles. These were then used in conjunction with a deck of cards to play a fast-paced miniature combat game on a tabletop. Though it had trading card game in its name and did feature cards that you could build a deck with in order to enhance the abilities of your miniatures, it definitely had the feel of a game such as Warhammer, or more appropriately, the X-Wing miniature game. In terms of the next collectible card game style game to hit stores, that would arrive in the form of 2012 Star Wars the Card Game from Fantasy Flight Games. Interestingly, despite prominently featuring deck building, it's based around the much more consumer-friendly living card game model, pretty much pioneered by Fantasy Flight themselves. What that means is that the expansion sets are released, but not in the booster packs or random cards. Instead, when you pick up a new set, you know exactly what cards it will contain in which number. They may introduce new settings, continue stories from prior sets, or bring new mechanics into the game. But ultimately, you know that if you have the same sets as your opponent, you're both building your deck from a level playing field. It does stop the meta game, whether that's local, casual, or in more competitive settings, devolving into the hunt for the rarest or most powerful cards, which can end up being a huge time and cost sink that ends up driving all but the most serious or wealthy players from continuing with the game. Once more, the designers of the particular game saw fit to split the cards into light side and dark side, with asymmetrical win conditions too. During the game, players attack their objective cards belonging to their opponent, as well as defending their own and using cards to help with the force struggle, which can allow the dark side to increase their Death Star dial if left unchecked. Though earlier games relied on movie stills and character photos for their card illustrations, Fantasy Flight instead commissioned their own artwork for Star Wars the Card Game. The original starter set box art did use a more photo-styled montage, but subsequent expansions used the painted art style of the cards, even when heavily photoed referenced in a few examples. This resulted in an absolutely gorgeous overall aesthetic for Star Wars the Card Game, akin to the beautiful, detailed illustrations you'd expect in games such as Magic the Gathering. Sadly, the living card game model couldn't financially sustain Star Wars the card game for the long term, and it was discontinued in 2018. Star Wars Destiny was also brought to market during the same period that Star Wars the card game was available. Based around character dice and manipulating them with a custom deck of cards, Star Wars Destiny didn't really feel like a collectible card game at all. Instead, it was a clever hybrid of dice-based combat and cards using events, upgrades, and supporting your characters. Like all the other Star Wars games that have been covered here, it required that players create a deck featuring characters from only one side of the eternal struggle in the Star Wars universe, but did allow players to combine characters from different eras of the saga. Star Wars Destiny was also relatively short-lived, being discontinued in early 2020. The next Star Wars card game from Fantasy Flight wasn't a collectible card game or a living card game, but it's definitely worth mentioning given the strength of its design and execution. Star Wars The Deck Building Game is a self-contained title released in 2023 that takes a lot of inspiration from one of the very best games of all time, Star Realms. Regularly featuring on our very own best of lists on our website, Star Realms has proven to be very influential. Its clever design and mechanics can be felt throughout Star Wars The Deck Building Game, though the latter does bring some ideas of its own to the table. Sharing the concepts of small starting decks with basic units, as well as a central card row and similar mechanics in other areas too, Star Wars The Deck Building Game diverges by splitting the players into the Empire versus the Rebellion. It's a fantastic game and one that shares a similar art style to the Star Wars trading card game Unlimited, which recently released. The card game sector has seen massive growth in 2023, fueled by the events such as Magic the Gathering's 30th anniversary, with their Lord of the Rings themed sets bringing lots of attention to the game, along with the launch of new trading card game Disney Lorcana. With so much attention on trading card games, it feels the right time that Star Wars made a comeback. Star Wars Unlimited, with appealing visual design, straightforward mechanics, and a simplified product range, has done really well already after launching just a few months ago. Perhaps there'll be fans whose interest waned after the death of the previous favourite Star Wars themed card games. Maybe this will interest the old Star Wars card game fans to take a little look at. Fantasy Flight have already announced numerous sets for Star Wars Unlimited, so it does seem as if they're in it for the long haul this time around. It's perhaps unlikely though, however, that even the very promising Star Wars Unlimited, designed from the ground up to be more accessible and have more mainstream appeal, will have the impressive longevity of the very first Star Wars collectible card game, the Star Wars customizable card game. Just like the universe, which launched on cinema screens a long time ago, it seems that Star Wars will always have a presence on the tabletops of card gamers. In some shape or form, the Force will always be with us gamers. So there you have it, a short look at the history of Star Wars card games. There's tons of content over on our website for you to consume, and hit that subscribe button if you want to see more story-focused videos like this about card games of all nature. Thanks for watching, see you in the next one. Bye-bye.